Hello and welcome to Outland Japan. I'm your host, Peter Carnell, a travel guide based in northern Nagano, and this is a podcast that takes you outside the big cities into rural, regional, and the wilds of Japan. And in today's episode, we head to the north of Kanazawa in Ishikawa Prefecture and onto the beautiful Noto Peninsula. Extending 100 kilometers into the Sea of Japan, Noto is known for its coastal landscapes, including terraced rice fields backdropped by the sea, bamboo-walled fishing villages, and thriving traditional craft scenes. It is here that we find our guest, Lauren Scharf. Originally from the US, Lauren is on the board of the Minka Preservation Society, a group dedicated to the conservation of Japan's wonderful heritage and historic homes, many of which fall under the designation of Minka or kominka, something we'll discuss. Lauren and her husband live themselves in a kominka, which they have restored, and as such, Lauren is very much part of an enthusiastic and dedicated community of Minka owners in Japan, and for that reason, I was very pleased when she agreed to speak. We discussed the Noto Peninsula and Lauren's home in the first part of the interview, before moving on to the Minka Preservation Society and discussion of the large earthquake that struck in 2024, an event which Noto has not yet recovered from. I know many of my listeners have an interest in setting up in rural Japan and finding a property, or perhaps you're already here and you're a kominka owner yourself. It's episodes such as this that I received the most requests for, and so a big thank you to Lauren for agreeing to be on the podcast. It's a topic I will certainly be returning to. Links to the Minka Preservation Society website, Facebook and Instagram are in the show notes, along with Lauren's personal Instagram. And as always, there's information and images related to today's episode on the Outland Japan Instagram and Facebook pages. You can also find the show on YouTube by searching Outland Japan Pod, and the website is outlandjapan.com. Lauren recorded the interview from her home on a particularly cold day with a warming wood stove behind her, something you'll hear crackling and clicking. It all adds to the interview and imbues our chat with an enticing, homely, rustic atmosphere. I hope you enjoy. My guest on the podcast today is Lauren Scharf, who lives on the beautiful Noto Peninsula in a 117-year-old kominka. Lauren is also a board member of the Minka Preservation Society. Lauren, thank you very much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
So, as I said, you're speaking to me from the Noto Peninsula. Would you mind placing that on the map for listeners? Where is Noto in relation to Tokyo and nearby cities and prefectures?
Sure. So if you're looking at a map of Japan and you're in Tokyo, if you took your finger and just went left, due west across Japan, you would come to the Japan seaside. And if you crook your index finger, you'll see a little peninsula sticking up. And that's the Noto Peninsula. So as a crow flies, it's just right across from Tokyo. It's Ishikawa Prefecture. We're south of Toyama Prefecture and north of Fukui.
So Ishikawa Prefecture is the same prefecture as Kanazawa. I imagine Kanazawa Station would be the nearest Shinkansen station to where you are. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's about, depending on traffic and conditions, 45 minutes to an hour drive.
Yeah, so quite readily accessible, but really it feels like a remote part of Japan, and at this time not attracting too much, certainly inbound tourism. It's a really beautiful part of Japan. So Lauren, would you mind describing what's it like in terms of landscapes, the coastline and daily life?
Yeah, it's a really beautiful peninsula, and actually it was really starting to have inbound tourism. It all came to a screeching halt on January 1st, 2024, when we had a major earthquake in the northern tip of the peninsula, which was devastating and really wiped out a number of cities and tourism spots. And I don't know if it will ever fully recover. There are certainly recovery efforts underway, but so much was lost. And the peninsula, like much of rural Japan, is mainly populated by people over 65 years old. So after the earthquake, many of them left to live with family in other areas. And the government is just trying to figure out how much money they want to put back into rebuilding, considering the average age of the population and predominantly farming communities. that aside, Noto is gorgeous. It has a very rugged coastline, beautiful rock formations, lots of rice fields, lots of forests, lots of mountains. It's kind of a microcosm of the country right here in one peninsula, with fabulous seafood and wonderful local farm-grown vegetables. Great place.
Yeah, that's a nice way of describing it, actually. Because when I went up there, it's kind of what I thought of it. It is a real microcosm of Japan. It had everything that Japan that you tend to love about it. And it was one of those little corners of Japan that when I went there, I said, okay, I need to move here. It's just so beautiful. And, it's a world away from Tokyo, even Kanazawa, right? There's no congestion. There's very few people. May I ask, what do you enjoy most about living there?
Well, we're right on the coast. We're on the outside of that peninsula, so on the Japan Sea coast rather than the Toyama Bay side, about a 3 or 4 minute walk from our house. So every morning we take our dog and we walk a couple miles up and down the coast. In the summer, we can go out swimming and paddleboarding and kayaking. There's actually a large surfing community just a little bit south of us.
Oh, interesting.
We don't surf, but it's fun to go out and watch all the guys come.
Yeah.
So that's quite lively. But then just a short drive away and you're in the mountains. There's some beautiful temples and shrines throughout the peninsula, all these little undiscovered spots.
Yeah, and we'll come back, if you don't mind, maybe later in the interview to have a chat about the earthquake and what the ongoing effects are at this stage, because it made the news when it happened internationally, but we haven't really probably heard much more about Noto since then. So if you're happy a bit later to discuss that,
sure.
Let's come back. I think, what is a wood stove behind you crackling away. How's the weather there today? It's very icy and cold here in Nagano. How is it there?
Yeah, we're having a rare sunny day. Noto does get a lot of rain, but it's right around freezing. So my husband's an early riser and he got the stove fired up actually probably around 4:30 this morning. So it's our main heat source, and he stoked it just before this interview so that he wouldn't be making noise in the background. So it's crackling away.
No, it's a nice ambience to have in the background. May I ask, where are you originally from and how did you end up on Noto Peninsula?
Originally from the U.S., but lived in many parts of the U.S., Washington, D.C., and New York, sort of young person, and then in Seattle, which is where I met my husband, who's actually from Scotland, but we met on an island off the coast of Seattle. And then together we lived in Alaska for almost 15 years. I came to Japan the first time out of college. I'd finished a master's degree, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I came to Japan to teach English and stayed about 1.5 years up in Hokkaido. And I just fell in love with Japan then. I knew I wanted to come back, but I wanted to teach at a university level. So that's when I went back to the States, went to Seattle to get an education degree. And that's when I met the person who became my husband. And when I moved back to Japan, I got a job in Kanazawa with the Parsons School of Design. It's an American university based in New York, a design school. And they had opened a campus in Kanazawa. So I came on board as an English teacher. Did that for 4.5 years. And then we did move to Alaska. Didn't expect to move back to Japan, actually, but around 2010, a friend who had stayed in Japan through Parsons asked me to help collaborate on a brochure to introduce Japanese art collectors to Kanazawa City so they could come and they could meet artisans and visit their workshops and ideally buy some work. So we started working on that, and organically over the next 1.5 years, it kind of morphed into an online magazine called The Art of Kanazawa. And we would interview many, many artisans living in Kanazawa. So we'd put up stories about them. And then these travel agents started contacting us asking if they could bring clients to meet these artisans. And that, again, organically kind of morphed into an inbound travel company. So by 2012, we had moved back to Japan and then started doing that full time. Noto was an accident. We always came up here just for fun and a drive. But somebody told me I should think about Minka and sent me to look at one, and that one didn't work out. But the second Minka we looked at was this one, and we just thought, why not?
Puts the hook in you, right? And then you find yourself before you know it. You're not going anywhere. As mentioned, you are on the board of the Minka Preservation Society, something we'll come back to. Before we get into that, I'd love to hear about your own home. As I mentioned, I believe your house is 117 years old. Can you tell me about your home and what do you know of its history?
Yeah, it was built in 1907, but the person attached to it from the city told us the main beams are much older and were probably salvaged from whatever stood here before and reused again, because they're actually quite massive for a house this size in this area. So his thought was this was the honke, the head house of the 4 or 5 houses that are around it. So it had the sort of the best beams, the best doors, the best layout. That being said, it's a fairly standard farmhouse, rural farmhouse. I mean, I have at this point been in many Minka, kominka around the country, and there's a huge range in terms of size and quality and design. And ours is definitely more on the rustic end of things, which suits us, especially after all those years in Alaska. Very sturdy. It is very sturdy. It did quite well in the earthquake.
They tend to, if they've stood for that long, they tend to just kind of keep standing. You hit on an important point there, though, Lauren. I think it sometimes gets missed with Japanese homes because 117 years, that's old. But maybe for any listener who's, for example, tuning in from Europe, maybe they think 117 years, oh, that's not that old. But this is because, keeping in mind, Japanese homes are built completely from timber. Well, not completely, but the structure is timber. And so they're not built to last forever. They're built to be replaced. The other thing worth explaining is exactly when we refer to a kominka, or the word sometimes is abbreviated to minka, what do we mean by that? What is a kominka?
Right. So that's actually not a debate right now in the community, but a topic. According to Alex Carr, who's generally considered to be one of the experts in Minka, having renovated many of them over the last 50 years, he said until rather recently, everyone just said Minka. Minka literally means folk house or people's house. And then he said maybe around 10 or 15 years ago, somebody put the ko, and in this case, the ko means old. So old people's house or old folk house.
Interesting.
But he doesn't really know why that shift happened. And in his mind, they're all Minka. And it's somewhat redundant to be saying kominka. But that seems to be the phrase that's caught on. And that's what you hear people talking about now. But according to Alex and others who have been at this much longer than the rest of us, they're fairly interchangeable. And the code just reinforces something that already exists as an older building.
That's so interesting. I'd never heard that before. So you said as recently as 15 years ago that came into common use?
Yeah, because he's been writing and talking about these buildings since around 1970. I think he renovated his first one down in Tokushima. And he's like, yeah, it was Minka for 35 years, and suddenly it was kominka.
We've actually, on the podcast before, I've spoken with other guests, episode 2, episode 22, episode 31, who are also have purchased and reformed or in the process of doing so with kominka. So anyone who's listening to this and finds our conversation of interest and you haven't listened to those episodes, please feel free to go back and do that after our chat today. Lauren, could you describe your kominka in terms of its size, the layout, and the land that it's on?
We're lucky, I guess, or at least by our standards, we're lucky in that many of these beautiful old houses are set in compact villages. So all the houses are grouped closely together to make maximum space for the rice fields that generally surround them. This one is actually at the very end of a village, separated by some land. There are 2 or 3 houses close to us, but 2 of them are completely empty, and one is partly inhabited by a couple that live nearby, but come back and forth each day to do things in their original house, but don't sleep there. And we're at the end of a very narrow little driveway. I mean, it's sort of not even a cul-de-sac, it just ends. Our driveway is the end of the little road. So we have a lot of privacy. There's a bamboo forest behind us, and behind that is the ocean. Rice fields that we can't see because of trees to one side, and somebody's land on the other side of us. We're not sure who, but it's open.
Off and away. Don't know whose it is.
Yeah. So when we look out our windows, we don't see any other structures, which is really nice. I'm not good at the conversion, but I want to say around 3/4 of an acre land that came with it, perhaps a little less. Again, it's hard to say because we don't own that bamboo forest, but it's right behind us, and that's all we see, and nobody else seems to have anything to do with it either. So it feels like ours, but probably legally not ours. The house itself, it's a single story for the most part, with a half mezzanine floor, quite small, which you can barely stand up in. It's mostly used for storage. And then it has a huge attic space. but until we put some flooring up there, it was just bamboo. So they would store not heavy things up there, but you couldn't really walk around up there. And there are no windows. We put enough flooring up there and parts of it that we could use it for safe storage, but we don't plan to develop it. So basically a single-story house. The part that we use every day is probably about 1,500 square feet, like around 150 square meters, give or take. Mm-hmm. And then there's another little wing off the back that was built in the 1960s. The family must have grown and they needed a couple extra rooms. So 2 6 tatami mat rooms back there that we use as guest rooms.
And like most kominka, I imagine a thatched roof. Is the thatched roof covered?
No, it's tile. In fact, relatively few kominka still have thatched roofs, or if they have them, they've been covered with tin or some other composite for not centuries, but for decades.
It previously had a thatched roof and it's been tiled, or?
This area wasn't known for thatched roofs. I think there's one thatched roof house in the entire village. It's about 300 years old and has been maintained by the community, but all the rest are kawara.
Do you know the reason for that?
I don't. It seems to be a regional thing. Areas that have more thatched roof. Heavier snow areas seem to have more thatch than tile. So like up in Shirakawa-go and Gokayama in the Alps they're all thatched roofs. Miyama outside of Kyoto, thatched roof village.
Yes, but around here, certainly.
I'd say they're probably less than 10 or 15% of all Minka are thatched roof.
Interesting. That's really interesting to think of that variation between the regions. May I ask, Lauren, how did you come to acquire the property?
On my 50th birthday, a friend of mine in Toyama sent us a link to this beautiful, old, much older, much bigger kominka for sale right in the middle of Noto Peninsula. We hadn't thought of acquiring a Minka up to that point. We loved them, but we didn't think it's what we needed. There's just 2 of us and various animals. But we went to look at that one because it was a beautiful day and we went for a drive and we thought, wow, this is pretty amazing. Maybe there's a lot of potential here. Let's see where this goes. And the woman was very happy to meet us and offered us a ridiculously low price for it. And we signed the paper, but then it turned out that she was the wife and there was still a husband, but he was against the sale and refused to sell for that price and wanted something like 10 times the price she had offered us. And so we walked away from it. It would have been a huge undertaking, and it was a good 2.5 hours from Kanazawa too. So, but there was a real estate agent attached to it that we became friendly with, and she felt bad about that. And she said, I'll find you another one. And we said, well, okay, if you do, great. We didn't really think about it again. And about 4 or 5 months later, she called and said, I think I found one that's better for you guys. And it was this one. It was listed in the Akiya Bank, but it was also privately listed. So she had come through it through word of mouth, realtor, word of mouth, I guess. But because it was listed in the Akiya Bank, that was a benefit for us because there are often incentives for people who buy things through the Akiya Bank. And in this case, the city of Hakui was willing to give us 1 million yen towards the renovation of it, which was about a quarter of the selling price. We just had to move our Juminhyo, our residency, to Hakui, and they quite happily gave us all that money towards the renovation. We just had to keep receipts, and someone came and took pictures periodically.
So in the end, the process of acquiring the home that you have sounds quite smooth, but in the lead up to that, you had the disappointment of missing out on the other home and encountering some of those obstacles people often do where family members of the current owners don't agree on the price, they want to think about selling it, all those frustrations that come along. Yeah,
I could certainly tell you many stories about people and the trouble they've had acquiring their kominka. It can really be so frustrating. 4 or 5 siblings and they can't agree on anything, or even tracking down the person who has the actual ownership document. Or you need patience often. Again, that's why the Akiya Bank usually is a good way to go, in that by the time it gets there, these issues have all been sorted.
What was the condition of the house when you acquired it?
It had been empty for 5 years, and before that, just one very elderly woman lived in it. She was living basically in 1 or 2 rooms, and the rest of the house was just shut down. It wasn't in move-in condition unless we wanted to live in the one room like she did, which we didn't, but it wasn't falling apart either. There was no major structural damage. The roof had been replaced, I think, 10 years previously, so the roof is in great shape. But it was very old school. It had just one squat toilet, tiny old style bath. The kitchen was this little add-on off the side of the house. It was very rustic. It did need a fair amount of work and attention before we were ready to move in.
And could you run me through the work that you've done, the renovation that you and your husband have done to the house?
The first thing we did was tear up, it was all tatami, old, nasty tatami through the whole house. So we removed it's not that I have anything against tatami, but this was a lot of tatami and it was in really bad condition. So we pulled all of that out. It was the first step in improving the land that became the garden. Lots of tatami decomposing in the garden. The boards underneath were actually in pretty good shape, but underneath those boards, there was nothing. The floors were not insulated. So we pulled up all of those boards as well. We had to replace a few of the joists were rotten, but nothing major. I think maybe 3 or 4 through the whole house. And then we insulated. So we put down the black tar paper and then 3 inches of insulation and then plywood and then eventually flooring. So the floors are very solid and very well insulated now. So that was our first big job that we did. And then the ceiling above the main part of the living room, which was open, was bamboo, as I said, to the attic. But they had a big irori, so years and years and years of soot just coated it. And so as much as we loved the look, we couldn't seem to get it clean, and we couldn't seem to stop it from raining down on us. So we eventually removed all of the bamboo. And we liked the look though, so we replaced it with reed. And then we put about a foot of this sort of organic insulation on top of that. So that ceiling is now insulated, but it still has that look of the bamboo ceiling. The kitchen had a artificial drop ceiling, so we pulled that down and beautiful beams appeared. And so we cleaned all those beams up and then put a floor. That's one of our floored areas of the second floor is what is now the kitchen ceiling. So it's the double height ceiling, but all the beams are exposed. So those are probably the biggest things we did just to get it sort of a naked place to start. And then it was mostly aesthetic work. Just where do you want a wall? What's going to be a bedroom?
Yeah, terrific. Have you done most of that work yourself or you've engaged professionals?
All of it. My husband is a professional everything builder. I mean, he's got a master joiner and stone and tile and electric and plumbing.
Oh, wow.
He's trained to do everything and he does everything. So
is he a man in demand? I imagine when people hear about that, there'd be lots of requests.
He is
come
very
and have a look at my
much
house for me.
I know. We're sort of kicking ourselves. We should have figured all this out 20 years ago. Would have had a great business. He's mostly pretty much retired now, so everything he does is just as a friend. He just helps people out with projects.
There's a lot of reports about very cheap or even free houses, including kominka in Japan. And while it's true, and as you referenced yourself, these houses can be cheap to purchase, that almost invariably means there'll be a significant cost in making them livable. And from the people I've known who've taken on kominka, there's plenty to consider in terms of costs and challenges along the way. So I always think that cost shouldn't be the primary motivation if you are looking to take on a kominka. Would you agree with that? And have the overall costs and experience of renovating one met your expectations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking just for us, if my husband weren't someone who could have done all the work himself, I'm not sure it's something we would have taken on unless we had the resources to hire a crew. And then it's finding a good crew. And a number of people we know who have had to hire someone else to come in and do it. Very mixed stories, from absolutely wonderful people, wonderful work. They did an amazing job to struggles and cost overruns and the carpenters insisting on doing things the Japanese way and not listening to what the new owners want, those kind of issues. And I think part of living in a Minka, and this is something that comes up when we have the Minka events, people seem to fall into 2 schools. Either the keep the bones of the building, but basically strip it down and renovate it back to 21st century standards where everything's, triple glazed windows and super insulated and just everything modern technology can possibly do, you put in. And then the other end of the continuum would be live in it as it was meant to be lived in and adjust yourself to the seasons, light a fire when it's cold, open the doors when it's hot. And most of us fall somewhere in between, I think. We're probably closer to the live in it as it was meant to be lived in.
So, Lauren, you are a board member of the Minka Preservation Society. Could you run me through the background of the organization, who's involved, and what initiatives are you involved in?
The Minka Preservation Society is a fairly new society that is an offshoot of Kominka, Japan, which started in 2016 when my husband and I went down to Hanase in Kyoto to meet another American who we had a mutual friend in common who had also recently purchased a Minka. And we were sitting around talking, and I said, it'd be cool to have a Facebook page about this because there's a lot of us and the numbers are growing. He's like, okay, I'll start one up. So he started a Facebook page called Kominka Japan. And for probably the first 4 or 5 years, we had 9 members. And, it didn't really grow at the speed we had hoped. But then 2 things happened. First, I found out about another Facebook group called Building and Renovating in Japan. And a lot of the people that were in that group actually had Minkas. So we posted on their site to say, hey, we love what you guys are doing for people that are specifically Minka oriented or heritage building oriented. Come check out our group. So that a lot of people got interested at that point. And then COVID. Over COVID years, people spent a lot of time in front of their computer dreaming about not COVID. And Japan seemed to really catch a lot of people's imagination during that period. And the stories about the free houses and the cheap houses started coming out. So between those 2 factors, the numbers grew quite a lot. We started having an annual event called the Kominka Summit, the Minka Summit. So for 3 days, once a year, everybody would gather, and we had speakers and a Minka mall and festivities. And so the organization was sort of growing and moving forward. And then, as happens when you have a board, not everyone always agrees. And it caused a schism, unfortunately. So rather than stand and fight, we just decided the world is big enough for 2 groups. In fact, the more the merrier, right? The more people that are trying to save these buildings and talking about saving these buildings, the better.
Every Kominka owner that I know is very passionate about it. It seems like a very passionate community, but it also appears to be a very diverse group of people. Has anything surprised you about why so many foreigners are keen to take on the challenge of life with a Kominka and what motivates them to do so?
I guess I'm surprised by how many people who don't currently live in Japan are interested in this. I mean, looking at the analytics from the original group, which had gotten up to almost, I think, over 4,000 members. I mean, considering I don't know how many Facebook groups I've joined at one time or another. I know the majority of those, I think of the 4,000, maybe 10% were regular contributors and regular listeners, but a lot of them are from overseas, and it's their dream. I mean, you read the exchanges, and it's often like, I'm in Australia. A lot of Australians, I'm in Australia, but it's our dream, after the kids are off to school, or, we would love to spend part of our year in Japan, and we love these old houses. Yeah. So I think there's part of it is the just genuine love of what is really a beautiful piece of architecture. But also the better or worse, and I think maybe worse, all of the hype in the last couple of years about get a free house. Japan has free houses. Japan's giving away houses. People look at that and think, well, gosh, I could buy an old house and fix it up for less than half of what it would cost me to buy a new boring house in my country. So I think that's a big part of the appeal. The one thing that we're trying to educate people about is that you're buying more than a house, though. I mean, as you know, as someone who lives in Japan, you don't just buy a house and live your private little life. Even us in our somewhat isolated area, we still communicate with our neighbors. We're still part of the community. There are expectations of us for being members of the community. So to sort of come here and think you can just ignore everything around you except your house is not ideal. So we're really trying to focus on the community aspect of living in Japan.
Yeah, I think that advice is invaluable because you have to engage, particularly if you are in a rural area in Japan, which is where most of these kominka are going to be. You're going to have to engage and be part of the community. And when I say engage, that comes with more involvement and commitment that probably does be engaging in the communities in Western countries. So it's something which needs to be considered. What support does the Minka Preservation Society provide to its members?
Just being there, I guess, to be a source of information and support. We hope to connect people when you get to an area, help people find local builders that will work in your area, people deciding should they keep their thatch or should they go with, a modern roof. Any of those sorts of technical questions, we will have experts that can help answer and help speak to these questions.
And as you mentioned, events coming up from January 1st onwards in 2025.
Our first event will be in April in Keihoku, and it'll be maybe a 1 or 1.5 day event focused on traditional building. So there's a Japanese carpenter who lives in that area, and he and his wife, who's American, they're master builders and also master stuccoers, shikui. They're planning to open a trade school, to teach anyone who wants to learn how to do their own renovations and their own traditional building. There's also a master thatcher in that area who will be involved to help people learn about thatching. So that'll be the first event, mid-April. We will have something over the summer, and late fall we will have the 3-day event, which I think we're going to call Minka Con. And it will be it will be held in Aichi-ken in Shinshiro. Lots of Minka in the area. We always include a Minka tour so people can go around and see existing Minka that have been renovated to get ideas. Speakers and food and entertainment and
tremendous. So obviously anyone who is interested, just look at the Facebook and the website and all the information will be there. And I'll make sure to include those in the show notes of today's episode. I'm just curious, Lauren, we are obviously focusing on the kind of foreign market and those people who are interested in taking on kominka. In your experience, do you see the same trends in Japan with younger Japanese choosing life in rural areas and choosing to purchase kominka?
Yes, it's a minority to be sure. But it even started during COVID. It increased because Japan, for the first time, acknowledged remote work is a thing. So people were able to do their jobs and not be in Tokyo or Osaka. So that certainly helped. But even well before COVID, there were communities around Japan that were more tackling the depopulation. So you would hear about villages where, if you're under 40 and you can make a living from this village, we will give you a house. Or, you pay $25 a month for 2 years, and if you're successful, you can keep your house. These kind of programs are starting to pop up, targeted at young Japanese people. At our events, probably 20%. 20 to 25% of attendees are Japanese. Often it's the spouse of the foreigner who's impassioned, but there are also dual Japanese couples doing it. And just without any fanfare around Japan, you find Japanese people, individuals and couples that have just on their own decided to do this. And that's something we will be profiling on the new website. There will be a section called Beyond Minka, where we're just going to focus on people, any nationality, but anywhere in Japan that are doing something interesting with an older building, not just Minka, but machiya and kura, and factories, schools. There'll be a form where you can recommend someone So let's say you had lunch at this amazing little place in, rural Toyama a couple of years ago, and you think, oh, that's perfect. They renovated it. Now they're making goat's cheese and blah, blah. So we'll happily accept suggestions from our readers.
Final thing I want to ask you in relation to kominka is, what value do you see in saving these houses, and what happens if they are not saved?
They're just such a part of Japanese history, and they are disappearing so rapidly. Without them and with all the modern housing that's going up around Japan now, it would just be a loss of important aspect of Japanese history and Japanese culture. Probably the majority of the Japanese population still don't care about Minka and have no interest in saving them. But for better or worse, now that there is all this hype from foreigners coming in and valuing them and wanting them, it does seem to be catching the attention of Japanese media. So there has been more of a push recently to help preserve some of these old buildings. Other countries have heritage home associations. Japan doesn't really have that. I mean, there's some temples and shrines and whatnot, but among private homes, it's pretty rare.
It surprises a lot of foreigners when they come here, I think, that Japan doesn't have those heritage overlays that certainly Australia does. I imagine the United States does.
Yeah, it's a big deal in the US. And as you mentioned earlier, compared to Europe, homes in the US aren't super old, but we do have homes that date back, to the 17th century, at least, late 16th century. We have one in our family. My cousin still lives in a house from 1648, I think. That's been in the family all these generations. And
which part of the United States is that? Where is that?
In Maryland, just outside of Baltimore. So one of the original colonies. And
that's very cool.
Yeah, and it's taken so seriously, and the family is so proud of it. So to come here and feel like every house, every Minka should have that same level of respect.
Finally, I'd like, with your permission, Lauren, to return to what you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, the earthquake that occurred there on New Year's Day 2024, which resulted in significant loss of life and damage across Noto Peninsula. It's my understanding that throughout 2024, the region also experienced large aftershocks, and while it has somewhat fallen out of the news, recovery efforts are ongoing and will take a long time. Lauren, would you mind explaining what took place on that day and the damage that occurred?
Yeah, it was an unusually temperate day. It was fairly warm and sunny. And yeah, I think it was around 4 p.m, it just started. And I think it ended up being 3 sort of back-to-back earthquakes, all 7.4, 7.5 magnitude. And then there was the immediate concern of tsunami. And there was, in fact, a tsunami. It turned out not to be catastrophic, but it certainly did a fair amount of damage up on the tip of the peninsula. Significant number of houses, especially in the top part of the peninsula, just collapsed. I mean, the majority of houses are over 100 years old. Almost all of them have tile roofs. So the combination of old timbers and 30% of the house's weight being in the roof just led to pancaking. And while Minka tend to be built to withstand centuries and so have quite heavy beams and supports, city housing, town housing does not. It's just stick housing with a super heavy roof. So there's just not enough to support those roofs the minute everything starts shaking. Almost until now, really, the focus has been on getting the roads reopened. There's significant road damage. What used to be a 2-hour drive from Kanazawa was taking 12 hours. I mean, it was that bad to get to the northern part of the peninsula. So they have repaired nearly all the roads, at least to the point where you can still move around the peninsula. After that, the focus, and simultaneous to that, the focus was on rehoming all of the people who lost their homes in the earthquake, which was tens of thousands of people. But there are still people living in high schools and gyms. And as you mentioned, ongoing earthquakes. We just had a big one a couple of weeks ago, 6.8 or something.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. So they don't seem to be stopping, and it's making everyone wonder, do we want to stay in Noto?
So it sounds like it's going to be quite some time until daily life, well, it doesn't even return to normal. It returns to whatever the new normal is. Well, sorry, it becomes whatever the new normal is. What do you see as the long-term outlook for Noto Peninsula, and when will it be possible for tourism to start coming back? When do you think?
Yeah, that's really a difficult question, and one that many people are asking. The Noto had a few major industries, one of which was lacquerware in the Wajima area. Hundreds of years history of traditional lacquerware. Most of those artists. So Wajima not only had the earthquake, but after the earthquake, there was a major fire that took out about half the city of Wajima, including many of the lacquerware studios and the morning market, which was, some people say it's almost 1,000 years old, that morning market. It dates back that long. It was a fish market because it's a major fishing port. But because of the tsunami and the shifting of the seabed, the fishing is dead in that area now. They don't know if that's going to come back. The sea level rose 4 meters. Yeah.
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, 4 meters. It rose up. So the ports are destroyed. All of the offshore fishing is over.
Oh,
It's just
wow.
gone.
That's
Yeah.
devastating. I didn't know that.
So between that and the lacquer artists, that was Wajima's two main sources of income, and the tourism that both of those drew. Suzu at the very tip, which was closest to the epicenter, something like 90% of the buildings in the city of Suzu were affected. Suzu has Suzuyaki, which is a traditional form of ceramics that's native to that area. It's a certain kind of clay that's fired a certain way, but many of the artists use wood-fired kilns, and the kilns did not survive the earthquake. So a number of them are moving out to try to find other places to build a kiln that would be safer. So yeah, people keep asking me, because I work in travel and I advise a number of other companies that bring people to Noto. They're all asking, like, when can we bring our people back to Noto? When can we include the tour again? Maybe by 2026, some of the accommodations will be up and running again. I know there's a small travel company on Notojima, a small island next to Noto, that does bike tours, and they have already started doing some bike tours in that part of Noto. So there is already some sign of life and some return to the southern part of the peninsula. Our area has recovered probably about 80%. So people could come up this far, but unfortunately, central and northern Noto are still in pretty bad shape.
I'm so grateful that you agreed to the interview today. Firstly, to talk about your kominka and what you're doing with the Minka Preservation Society. But for quite some time, actually, I've wanted to discuss Noto on the podcast, but also sensitive to the timing of it, because it sounds like it's a way off until it is in a position to accept tourism to come back. But important to keep it on people's radar, because I think that often happens, doesn't it, in the case with these areas that experience, any area that experiences a disaster. There's that immediate coverage, and then very quickly the news cycle moves on and you don't hear much. A good example being, I hadn't heard that about the fisheries at all, that had happened, which is devastating. Yeah, I just hope that things will improve and then people can start heading back up in that area, because I think it was coming onto the radar for international tourism. It's such a beautiful part of Japan. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. Lauren, for anyone who is looking for more information about the Minka Preservation Society, we've already mentioned the Facebook and the website. Do you mind just giving those again, or any other contacts or resources that you can recommend?
Yeah, those are the two main ones. By that name, Minka Preservation Society, but the Facebook page and the website. The website is minkasociety.com. We have Instagram also. It's Minka Preservation Society, all one word for Instagram.
I'll make sure to include the links in the show notes of today's episode, so you'll be able to find them there. Lauren, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really have enjoyed it. I love doing these episodes about kominka. It always lights a fire inside of me to say, maybe we should get one and go back and raise it with my wife. And just, I know I can anticipate her reaction will just be, that noise that she makes if I raise it with her again. But yeah, thank you so much. And I hope that we can meet face to face at some point. If I'm up there or if you come down here, please let me know. So all the best.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for today. Thank you once again to Lauren for agreeing to speak with me and sharing the images used in support of the episode. The website is, once again, minkasociety.com. That's MINKA society.com. While you can find them on Instagram and Facebook by searching Minka Preservation Society. You can also follow Lauren on Instagram at Nippon Discovery. The podcast website is outlandjapan.com, while you can also follow the show on Insta, Facebook, and YouTube by searching Outland Japan. Images and information related to each episode, including upcoming episodes, can be found on those pages, so make sure to follow. My name is Peter Carnell. This has been Outland Japan. I'll be back with you in a couple of weeks' time with the next episode. Until then, bye for now.